Bonjour à toutes et tous. Bienvenue au 12e colloque KIX LAC, éduquer en temps de crise et faire face à l'urgence, des réflexions menées à partir de la
Welcome
recherche.
to the second colloquium of Education in Times of Crisis, reflections regarding research and identification of opportunities and things having to do with Latin America and the Caribbean. I welcome you all, and we are going to wait just a few minutes.
Good morning, colleagues. We're really glad to have you here. We are starting in a few minutes. We're just waiting a few people, but we are already prepared. Please, if you need interpretation, you can choose in the bottom below the screen. You can find interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. A los colegas que hablan español, también les
For those
comento.
colleagues who speak Spanish, I would like to also let you know that we are going to begin very briefly. Everything is prepared to begin. I just wanted to let you know that you can choose the language of preference. Presentations will be in English and in French. However, there is interpretation to Spanish as well as English and French regarding the language you may prefer. Thank you very much.
Donc, on va commencer cette journée. On est très ravis d'être ici avec tout le monde. Nous sommes reconnaissants à tous ceux qui ont
So now
accepté.
we are going to begin, and we are very happy to be here with you and that you have accepted this invitation. Thank you all who are present and those who are listening to us today. We would like to ask if you can mention your name and the country you are coming from, the institution you are coming from, and if there is a theme in your research. Today, we have a great variety of researchers from the region with us, and we would like to promote an exchange between those who are present. So if you have a question, you can use the question and answers or the chat box. This event is also in our social media, and we would like to invite you to follow us in our Facebook fan page, KIX LAC Hub. And you can follow each of our activities and events that we carry out, and also on the social media of SUMA. We are present on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and the web page of SUMA, suma.org. We are keeping an eye on our social media, so don't just go ahead and ask any questions if you would like to during this colloquium. And we would like to invite you to share on social media with the hashtag KIX LAC, education in times of crisis. It's an honor to be able to be here with you today and have representatives of 4 countries of the region to be able to talk about the opportunities and challenges that come up in situations and crisis in the region. We know that this region has a lot of crisis and is going through a lot of difficulty, and it's a very important moment to be able to reflect regarding this. And as Raul just mentioned, this colloquium will be in French and in English with interpretation available for Spanish, and you can choose your language. Today, this event will be divided in 2 parts. The first part will be regarding the challenges having to do with research for access to education in times of emergency. Our main speaker will be Dr. Joel Werrican, who is the director of the School of Education of the Universities of West Indies. And we will also have the presence of Sonia Anderson and Nathalie Jamfe, who are the assistants of education. And the last presentation will be presented by Raúl Chacón and by myself as well, Maciel Morales. The second part of the meeting today will be regarding the experience, the challenge of education in the context of crisis and emergency. We will be listening to Dr. Charnet Bisiet from the University of Guyana and Dr. Lefranc Roussef from the University of Haiti. There will be a pause between. There will be a pause in between, and I will be also now. I will give the floor to Florencio Ceballos, who is a sociologist, master of the University Paris in France, to have this knowledge exchange.
Merci beaucoup, Maciel. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Welcome to.
Well, good day to everybody.
I will try to be very brief. I first would like to thank, and I will switch to English. I will not move back to French because I know that drives our translators crazy for a good reason. I would like to thank first SUMA, OECS, and the participants for this opportunity. The Knowledge and Innovation Exchange main mandate is to generate and mobilize knowledge. And that implies supporting and giving visibility to research at different stages and levels, from large, multi-year, multi-country, multi-million dollars that we have founded through KIX, to those that are smaller and contribute a lot to the understanding of the problems on a local and applied level. Those are as important as those big fishes. I would like to say that educating in times of crisis is a central issue, something that has been identified and surfaced by colleagues and partners in all the regions where KIX works. And I think that it's important also to remind or to consider or to point out that crises are multiple. We're not talking about one crisis. It's a climate crisis, our political and economic stability, migratory processes, violence, and so on. So crisis is in plural in this case. And I think that beyond or under circumstantial emergencies, what is represented here is an underlying and rather complex process that we could call crisis. And even though those days, this crisis has a name, which is COVID-19 and the learning losses left by the pandemic and how that witnessed the national education systems, I think it's important to consider that it only came to amplify and accelerate a crisis that already existed. And I think that this perspective should not be lost. So I hope that today will be a day to learn a lot, but also to debate and compare and discuss a lot. I will be happy to be part of this discussion. So without further ado, I would like to thank everyone and wish the best luck for today's activities. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
Merci beaucoup, Florencio, pour tes paroles de bienvenue. Et on est vraiment ravis de cette opportunité.
Thank you, Florencio, for these welcoming words. And we are very happy to be with the researchers here today. And I have the privilege of presenting the first journal of research having to do with KIX LAC. First, I would like to thank all of the partners who contributed in this compilation of articles when we carried out our first colloquium in 2021. I would like to thank GPE, KIX, AME for participating in this event, which is a great effort, a collective effort of the different partners and KIX LAC to be able to go further beyond this first colloquium and to try to get out the research, the articles, the studies of the researchers. This magazine or this journal is a compilation of 7 articles that were presented in the colloquium regarding times of crisis and emergency. And we placed the accent on the Central American, Honduras countries, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, presenting challenges that are territorial challenges. And also, as Florencio said, in other crises, we use the crisis of emergency. So we focus on the well-being of the education community. It is very interesting to say and to expose the problems that exist in the region and to present strategies to be able to fight against the problems that have been identified. This journal, in this sense, has a lot of wealth. And this colloquium is available in Spanish and soon will also be translated into the different languages. We wanted to carry out this presentation to be able to say that this colloquium today, and in this colloquium, we have the intention of integrating the articles that have been presented today into the journal to be able to share this research that has been carried out in the region, and because we know that there is a lot of challenges and there's a lot of challenges to be able to promote this or to boost this in the region. And so we wanted to present this journal for this reason. So we are going to begin with our first panel of the day, which is concentrating on the challenges of research to reinforce actions that are focused on crisis and in the context of emergency. So we have the pleasure of counting on the presence of Joel Werrican. Joel works in education for more than 30 years. He is the director of education in the University of West Indies. He is also professor in interlinguistic education.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. And so I must say special thanks to you and all the sponsors of this great event. You may wonder about my topic, conducting research in the Caribbean, combating the biases of Western frames, when we are actually speaking about education in times of crisis and emergency. But in truth and in fact, as we think about research in the Caribbean and many parts of the world, that in itself is a crisis, the way in which research is done, the assumptions that are made, the findings and interpretations that are made that are often not reflective of the truth. So indeed, I consider that a crisis. I really want to start in the way that I start a lot of my presentations these days, to remind us about our context, the context of the Caribbean, which is very similar to the context of many other parts that are non-Westerns. So for example, in Latin America. Start by telling you, we were a colonized people. We were enslaved. We were decimated, indoctrinated. They used us for cheap labor. I should correct that. They used us for free labor through slavery and rich colonizers. They imposed on us foreign cultures, languages, societal norms, privileging the ways of the colonizers. It's interesting that to appear kind and benevolent, they introduced to us Christianity and things like education. And I like to say there was nothing kind about colonialism. In fact, it was brutal. So education, which they introduced in the Caribbean, with it came something called streaming. That's a system of stratification that you go into top classes and others are almost rejected. You go into top schools and others are marginalized. And at the end, when you leave secondary school in the Caribbean, or high school as some of you would call it, the certification exams, which says that you're ready for the world of work, or you're ready for university and college, only about 25% or even less meet the standards of 5 subjects with English and math. Just imagine that. Of the thousands of children, only about 25% meet the matriculation standards to get into college or university and into the world of work. How kind is that system? That is the system that we have clung to. I want to just, before I get into the presentation, I just want to quote the words of Day 2016. If you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, ask the one who is carrying it. And before I go into that, I want to just further highlight something that Day says. He highlights the expressed viewpoint that academic research is so thoroughly compromised by its entanglements with colonialism that it is fundamentally incompatible with indigenous communities and their priorities. So carrying the bag of salt, this is an interesting perspective on research. Who is carrying that bag of salt? Who is taking the burden? And there is of the opinion that knowledge cannot be merely garnered through observation as we do in research, or the fragmentation of measurement, all those measures that we impose on our subjects when we are doing research, that these are not enough. The question is, who is the knowledge expert in the context of research? Is it the researcher, whether it is a local researcher or a foreign researcher? Or is it the participants with their lived experiences? And this is an important question that we have to answer, because people come into our spaces and they do research and they go back with great findings, write it up, and the perspective that they present, we cannot recognize it ourselves. Quite often, it is not reflective of what is really happening on the ground. So I continue to ask the question, who is carrying that bag of salt? This is a Ghanaian proverb. Who is carrying that bag of salt? So I start with the premise that external researchers, though very important, I'm not minimizing their importance, are not the sole knowledge experts. In fact, they're not the ones carrying the bag of salt. Their research is often flawed and not reflective of the true picture. So when we think about researchers coming into our space, looking through Western frames, what are we talking about? We are talking about traditionally white, male, that has been widened, middle class. So they're looking through those particular lenses, often disregarding cultural and linguistic context of our region. And I'm sure that this has application into Latin America also. Privileging solutions that originate in the so-called first world countries and rejecting or at least devaluing local solutions. They have very little use for what our own common practices. And then they leave with distorted perspective. Our data is interpreted through Western lens and may be very misleading in those interpretations and quite biased. So I can give you an example. This is a school in Grenada, but this is reflective of most of our schools that were built in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s. And of course, these were built through external funding, through the funding agencies. And in those days, when they came with their development plans of building schools, they came with their architects and so forth. And their Western logic pretty much said, we need to build you schools in your hot climate that will keep the children and the teachers cool and nice. So they built them with all of these decorative blocks so that the breeze can go through very easily. Against what local knowledge was saying. Local knowledge was saying to them, but if you do this, when it rains, with driving winds, the students are going to be wet because the water is going to go through. This is how most of our schools are. But their Western logic prevailed and we got these schools. Well, guess what? These schools are also hurricane shelters. Can you see people being in here during a hurricane? If you know what a hurricane is, of 100 miles per hour wind, ferocious winds with rain and with floods. These are the structures that we have as hurricane shelters. These are emergency shelters. So in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, where you had a volcanic eruption last year, you had shelters like this. These are the schools that are used, but built through Western logic, through Western frames, knowing more than the local knowledge. Perception is bias. And I know many of you here may not be into the sport cricket, but I want to use cricket to make the point. Cricket is an international sport, and the Caribbean has a joint cricket team, unified cricket team. We were once the strongest team in the world. Ironically, we are called the West Indies, and we seem to proudly hold on to that name, forgetting that this is a name given to us by our colonizers. Having very little knowledge of the geography, ended up in this part of the world thinking that they got to the Indies, and rather than face the facts that they were not in the Indies, they held on to the name and just put the West to it. So they came to the West Indies. Now, we go to England, we have bilateral series. So we go to England to play cricket, generally often April through June. This is their summer months. But colleagues, for anybody who have gone to the UK, and for me from the Caribbean, these months are not at all warm. These are very cold and rainy months. And you're playing a sport. This is a sport that is played over 5 days. So it's a long game, 5 days or 5 to 6 hours per day. Our Caribbean players end up on the cricket field, and quite often you see them with their hands in their pockets. And you'll hear the English commentators speaking about them as if they are not interested. How could you be on a cricket field with your hands in your pocket? You know, cannot look through the frames of a Caribbean person and realize that they are cold, they're warm in their hands. Even though when the play is ready, their hands are out of the pockets, they're alert, they're ready to go. That's not how they've seen it. They've seen it through their frames that these months are not so cold. They're accustomed to it, of course, but a Caribbean person who is not accustomed to it, they just cannot envisage that it is a level of discomfort for them. So colleagues, we see things through our own frames, and with it come perception biases. So you have bias of language, because if you speak standard English and you're hearing a different language, a so-called dialect, you may not take kindly to it. You come to do research, the culture is different from yours, but you're interpreting it through your culture. You have a different education system, and that encroach on how you interpret the educational data, and you come with your own philosophies. That is the Western frame. So what do they see when they come to the Caribbean? They often see small island states, and even the countries of the Caribbean that are on the South American or Central American mainland, they still see them as small countries with small population. They see their colonial history, and with that colonial history, they see us as people who are dependent, mendicants, even beggars. They see us as a broken region that they can fix. So they come in to do that research with those perceptions and thinking that, oh, the research that I do, the interpretations that I make is going to help to fix a broken wheel. So when they come in to do this research, then there's some methodological challenges that are presented. I like to speak about the insider-outsider, the EMIC-ETIC conundrum. And it's not that one is better than the other. And I'm not at all advocating that research cannot be done in a region by outsiders, but that you have to realize that there are certain conundrums that exist. You have the insider view versus the outsider view. And in research, there's a saying, make strange that which is familiar. So if you're part of the research context, to do it objectively, make strange, be objective, make strange that which is familiar. But the conundrum is that it says also, make familiar that which is strange. So you come in as an outsider, you have to make the context familiar. So what is the Caribbean reality for the insider-outsider? We are small states. But with small states comes something very interesting. One person quite often wears multiple hats. So the example that I like to use is that I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I work at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, 2 different islands. Quite often, I do work for the Ministry of Education. I go into the country, sit with the Ministry of Education, help to shape policy and so forth. We have discussions. So I'm known in my country, even though I'm living outside, as somebody who does work with the Ministry of Education, with the college. I'm actually the chair of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College Board. But there are times when I go into that space to do research, and I go in as an outsider from the university. So here I am, supposedly that ETIC person coming in with that outside lens, going into a space where they do not see me as an outsider. They see me with EMIC views. You're coming to do research, but I know you do work with the Ministry of Education. You do stuff with the college. And so there can be a certain level of distrust. So sometimes when you think you're ETIC, you're not quite ETIC, you're still EMIC. So researcher participants are aware of my involvement in the research, of the formulation of policy and practice, and they may become guarded because who am I? Am I the researcher or am I linked to the Ministry of Education? So those are some of the things that you grapple with in small states and small regions like the Caribbean. And then from another perspective, when it comes to EMIC-ETIC, the Caribbean reality, when the researcher is from outside, meaning from a Western country, participants may talk to the researcher. But as Peter Roberts pointed out, they do so with ambiguities and ambivalence because they're distrustful. So they're not quite given straight factual answers. As we say, there's a saying, we speak through both corners of our mouths. So you're not quite sure what is the message, but the outside researcher who does not understand that believes that they're getting facts from the person, when in truth and in fact, the participant is suspicious, guarded, using guarded language, and which may be misinterpreted by that researcher. So what happens when those researchers come in, that ethic researcher, that person from the UK, from the US, from places like that, from Canada, they come to the Caribbean, they're interviewing somebody, they may hear halting language, jerky language, a bit laborious. They may hear the misuse of some English words. They may see lack of eye contact, which is somewhat cultural. Depends on your social class. You might find you're not looking a person directly in the eyes. There's research on that. Participants are looking away. And as a result, the interpretation that is given by that external researcher is that that person lacks knowledge of the phenomenon, or that they have weak cognitive processes. They're not quite bright. They're not intelligent. When in truth, the reality is that the participants are trying to use the perceived language of the researcher. Because our official language is English, even though our home language, our first languages are Creoles, some form of Creole, whether it's an English-based Creole or French-based Creole or vernacular of English. We are taught to believe that our language is standard English. So when a person comes in, the first thing the participants will do is to, out of respect sometimes, is to switch to an estimate of that standard English. And naturally, it is not their first language. So it is not spoken as fluently as if they were speaking the language of their home. Caribbean people tend to get formal when they have visitors. And not only when they have visitors, but if they distrust a situation or just do not have a complete understanding, and they switch to what they perceive to be the high language. We know all languages are equal linguistically, but in sociolinguistics, there's something called diglossia, where there is a perception that there is a high language and a low language. In the Caribbean, the high language is perceived to be standard English, and the low language perceived to be the Creole or the vernacular. So another challenge is data, how data is analyzed. So we have, for example, international data collected all around the world, and I'm using one that I write frequently about. I take their data and analyze. The OECD PISA data, that's where they test 15-year-olds across OECD countries and other countries in the world. Trinidad and Tobago is the only country in the Caribbean that has taken on this assessment. But when you look at the assessment in Trinidad and you look at the results, Trinidad performs, generally speaking, below the OECD countries. And in the OECD countries, it should be known that these countries, students are tested in official languages. So in the US, it would be English. Whether the child in the US is a Spanish speaker originally or French speaker, they'll be tested in English. In other countries, like France, will be tested in French and so forth. Now, there are studies on this PISA data that show, and we use Singapore as an example, when you look at the results of children who say they do not speak English at home, but they're tested in English, their performance is significantly below those of students who say they speak English at home. So how does that affect Trinidad? Now, In the case of Trinidad, all the 15-year-olds are saying English is their language because that's what we have been taught. So they're tested in English. And the results does not take into consideration that English is not our first language. So we are saying in interpreting data like this, you cannot just interpret it through Western frames. You have to know the context. You have to know that many of the children in Trinidad and Tobago, their first language is a Creole, English-based Creole. That Trinidad is right next door to Venezuela, and that there are large student populations that are from Venezuela, so that English is their first language, and so forth. So these are considerations in our writings that we say you should take into account. That quite often, when the OECD does its interpretation of the data, they do that in a sterile way through their Western frames without giving consideration to that context. And as I come to an end, conducting educational research in the Caribbean, some biases associated with Western frames, some things that we should bear in mind, that when they come, they should try to remember that the smallness of the space and the population can lead to some bias. That when you think you're collecting a certain type of data, this person is giving you information, knowing that because of the smallness, I may be able to be identified. So they're reluctant in giving you the truth because they do not want to be identified with what they have said. They should pay attention to colonial history, a history that has really impeded what we do in the name of education, that we are not making the kind of progress that we should make, and that how things appear is not what it always is. That in the Caribbean, we proudly say we have a British education system and we feel so proud of it, but it's an education that is failing most people. The language situation, you have to be aware of the language situation in the region, knowing that standard English is not our first language. And you have to understand the tendency to value things from outside over homegrown, so that when you come and you say certain things, people can listen and lap it up, even though it is not true, and then want to implement something that is not the best for us. So I'm saying we want to eliminate the biases, because with those biases, that kind of research, it renders our students, our teachers, our education system, our ministries of education almost voiceless and helpless. Quite often we do not see it. But when you read to see how we are portrayed in international arena, in the journals and so forth, we really seem to have no voice. And we are hoping that that more value can be paid to local solutions. So colleagues, I am saying conducting educational research in the Caribbean using Western frames does not work. Yes, traditions of research developed in Western societies have contributed useful guidelines for conducting research in the Caribbean, but it has not produced a model that is the best fit for the region. For that to happen, you have to ask the people in the region and listen to their answers, not through Western ears, not that understand the history, that do not understand the history, nor the culture, nor the ambiguities and ambivalence, nor the legacies of their colonial past. We cannot do it through those frames. We have to ask the ones who are actually carrying the bag of salt, and then we have to listen to them. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Guarrican. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'écouter votre présentation.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a pleasure to listen to your presentation, especially regarding the colonization, because this is a very transversal issue, and in my country as well as in Chile, with the indigenous populations, And there is a phrase that you said that impacted me, which is to go beyond the Western filter to be able to carry out research. It is so important to have the context of the territory to carry out a deep research. And I would like to thank you very much. And at the end of this panel, we will have a time of discussion in which we can answer questions from the audience and have more dialogue. Thank you. And now I would like to present Line with a presentation that is called INE and the Learning Agenda, Networking and Supporting Research. Sonia is the leader of a master's in education. She in Harvard in the area of international politics and also has a license in international relations in the San Francisco University. Will also be present, and she supports communication of Belgium Organization of Development for Education of the World Citizenship. She has a master's in public sciences and others. And we would like to thank Sonia and Natalie for their presence here today. Thank you very much, Maciel, and thank you very much to each of you. I would like to apologize because I am currently on a trip. Therefore, the sound may not be the most optimal one. I would like to present INE, INEE, which is the agency having to do with situations of emergency. And Sonia will present the research data. INE is a network, an interagency that is for situations of emergency. It unites agencies, ONGs, universities, governments, and other population that lives crisis or situations of crisis. We have more than 18,000 members and more than 4,000 organizations, and we are in 190 countries. And INE exists for its members and thanks to them. For all people that are in situations of emergency. We have a main strategic framework that we have to place a coordination of the different interns to be able to have a right to education. And then we have the reinforcement of the capability of providing a high quality and pertinent education for everybody. And as a third strategy is to be able to generate this knowledge for these practices and reinforce the base of research and the different contexts that we work with the member people, and to reinforce and diversify the network to be able to be enriched by the experience of each one. So we have the different themes. We have coherence between the developments of having to do with research and the definitions and quality measures, and also delivering well-being is very important. So how do we work? We have many different networks with communities having to do with language communities, and the official language is French, Spanish, Portuguese, and each language has a community with a facilitator to be able to reinforce those work having to do with language and on work of having to do with research that is translated so that it can be accessible to all languages. We also have a group, a work group, which is institutional, that regroups those in times of emergency with research themes, for example, educational policies. So in May 2021, the mandate ended and it produced a large amount of documents with group of reference that have characteristics that they can be used as consulting to consult, and they have certain technical aspects to be able to allow people to ask questions or to be able to get information or consult regarding different subjects. We have a team having to do with those things, having to do with emergencies or with a distance learning, with assessments and with tools that were conceived by different interns around the world. I'm sorry, one moment, we lost sound. We also have collaboration groups with those who allow us to work together with collaboration groups for teachers or faculty during times of crisis, with personnel having to do with the well-being and development and professional training of the teachers, professional teachers, with groups as well who allow support, psychosocial, psycho-emotional, and everything also having to do with the assessments. And we also have a team that is specialized in areas having to do with the opportunity to be involved with other people, to be able to develop knowledge regarding different issues, regarding the first infancy, adolescence, and youth, through having to do with methodology, different educational things. So we have also minimal languages. So the minimal norms, INEE, were developed from 2004 with this collaboration work between 500 teachers, pedagogies with many countries, with a base on this 552 countries through this development. And currently, I'm going to explain a little bit more what we are conceiving. I am sorry, the sound comes in and out. We have lost the signal from our original speaker. Unfortunately, at this moment, we cannot hear the speaker, therefore we cannot interpret for her.
On a quelques problèmes techniques, donc peut-être songe si tu veux continuer la présentation parce
We have
que
some technical issues, therefore we are going to go on with a different presentation because Natalie is having difficulties.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in if that's helpful. I know that I think Natalie was maybe sharing slides. Oh, it looks like you're back now.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you,
We'll let
Sonia.
you wrap up. Yep, and then I'll come in. Thank you,
I got
Natalie.
disconnected.
No problem.
Sí, me desconect. I got disconnected.
You're on mute now.
She's muted at this time.
ton micro, Nathalie, je ne sais pas si tu es en train de parler.
Désolée, j'arrivais pas à trouver le bouton du micro. Les aléas de la technologie.
I apologize. I could not find the microphone button. Oh, this thing of technology. Therefore, I will start up again. We have the minimal norms, which are coordination with the access and having to do with learning. We have teachers and other educational personnel, and these are the norms, the minimal norms that establish the why. They are qualitative, they're very ambitious, universal, and they can be applied in any environment. Then we have certain actions, the what, which are the proposals of measures to be able to respond to these norms. And then each one also has the how, which are the good practice elements that we must consider for the application of minimal norms and for the adaptation as well for the key actions in each one of the different situations. So this was applied in different contexts with norms that were shared, and therefore we have this context of the norms for each country, for each territory, and its particularities of each location. So we have this diversity of languages with preparation having to do with that has quite relevance. So all of these differences are applied to the different contexts of each one of the countries. Therefore, here you can see the publications that the people who work on this have published, and which is also from last year with indicators that allow us to establish the preparation of the projects. And it's also a work that is being carried out and developed in the physical education and in the gender dimension that can be applied with gender education, education in terms of conflict, education, with all of these contributions that are available in completely free on the website. And in these collections, you can also carry out, you can review everything that might be interesting for you. It's completely free. So there's also an online assistance with the interns who are in the investigation area with answers that you can get responses within 24 hours. We also have this exchange site with the whole community. So there is this platform that has to do with messaging, and all of the members of the INEE can come in and exchange here in the platform. And you can also create a channel. It's called Slack. You can also create a channel that has to do with a theme. For example, the libraries research, which allows you to share and also find other people and establish research exchanges. In other initiatives that I would like to present, I am so sorry. Once again, we lost the sound. And the interference is not allowing me to understand what the speaker is saying.
Au Venezuela, en Haïti, en Colombie, en Brésil et au Mexique.
We also have a work that is being carried out in Bolivia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, with people who represent these countries to facilitate this research exchange. I am going to give Sonia the word now. She will take the floor, so she will continue speaking about this research.
I know the interpretation is fantastic. I've been listening to the other languages. But first, I just wanted to thank Summa KIX for the opportunity to speak and connect with you all today. And a sincere thanks as well to Dr. Warakan for the important and critical presentation. I think we could take an entire day or more to discuss, of course. And I wish that we had the time to really focus on those issues of decolonizing knowledge, but I really appreciate your presentation. So as Natalie's been sharing, we're obviously taking a slightly more kind of global scope in ours, and hopefully introducing you to INEE as a network that is a resource for all of you engaging in research, in education and emergencies, and in education more broadly. So I'm going to share a little bit about a few specific initiatives that we have around data and evidence that I think could be beneficial for you. INEE, of course, is a network that is led by and working to support its members. So a priority for us moving forward is, of course, localizing knowledge production and dissemination, and working to better connect with and serve regional and national stakeholders in the restructure, which I believe Natalie mentioned as well. So just a few points, and then we'll wrap up, because I know we've been presenting for some time now. Our work around data and evidence is driven by our strategic priority 3. I won't read through each of these actions and outcomes, but this is really our overarching framework that guides our work in this area. Next slide, please. And one of the primary resources, next slide, is the E-Cubed Research Fund. So this was a $10 million US fund over 5 years between 2017 and 2021. Unfortunately, we've just wrapped up the 5th and final call for proposals in this iteration of the fund, but we are actively seeking support to continue with E-Cubed, not this year, but hopefully in years to come. And this fund aimed to generate and disseminate relevant and usable research that contributes to knowledge and practice, with the aim of supporting education during crises and large-scale disruptions. We were really prioritizing research led by or inclusive of academics and practitioners in crisis-affected contexts. And within this program, INE managed the proposal submission, review, and research dissemination processes, as well as convening a grantee learning community, while Dubai Cares, who is the funder of this 10 million USD fund, made final funding decisions and managed ongoing grants once funds were distributed. So as I mentioned, we did wrap up our 5th and final call. We will be engaging in an evaluation of the research fund and including this in our recommendations of how the fund might move forward, but not an immediate resource, but hopefully in the future, again, something to look out for. I think this is unique in the sector as a fund that priorities are not identified or driven by global or global north institutions. We look for research being proposed from communities affected by conflict and crisis, who we believe are best placed to identify research priorities. Next slide, please. The second initiative that I wanted to mention is the INE Learning Agenda. So this is a process that we began in 2017 and 2018, holding a series of regional and global consultations to identify existing evidence gaps. So we brought together academics and practitioners in 3 regional consultations in Bogota, Dhaka, and Amman, as well as in a global scope in New York, really to understand what the critical evidence gaps were in these contexts, as well as gaps in types of evidence, and then to map ongoing or emerging research projects or partnerships. So understanding that as a sector, we don't always do the best job in sharing research before it's finalized. So we want to be able to share ongoing research so that other funders of research or researchers are not engaging in similar research and duplicating efforts. And then also, of course, just support dissemination of research once it is produced. This, if you go to the next slide, this information will be collected and housed on an evidence platform that INE is currently developing, which will again be a place for us to map those critical evidence gaps across contexts. And for us, we've organized those gaps by the minimum standards domains, as Natalie mentioned. We also have them organized thematically. And then to also interact with existing research around these specific evidence gaps. And we will engage in a yearly process to revise these evidence gaps. So to ensure, to validate them if they are still existing, or to revise and include new evidence gaps as they emerge. So again, the evidence platform is under development, but once it is live, we're hoping towards the end of the year, hopefully it will be a strong resource for all stakeholders that are engaging in kind of knowledge production and use in the education and emergency sector. Next slide, please. Finally, well, not finally, I will be showing one more initiative, but the Journal on Education and Emergencies hopefully is a resource that you are all well aware of. INEE supports the journal specifically in kind of the dissemination side of things. The journal is, of course, led by and also housed at NYU under Dr. Dana Birdie. The journal aims to publish rigorous scholarly and applied work, stimulate research and debate, promote learning across service delivery organizations, academic institutions, and policymakers, and define knowledge gaps and key trends. And it is surely a resource for those of you that are hoping to publish your research, to submit articles or case studies to the journal. Sometimes there are specific calls for content around a specific thematic area, and sometimes we have more general EIE focused issues. So again, just highlighting a resource also, of course, to read as a fantastic way of staying up to date on key evidence in our sector. Next slide. And the final initiative that INEE has, that these are amongst a variety of others, so I'm just highlighting these four, that I do think is a useful resource, is a network space that we have around data in education and emergencies. So this is a group that we convened in 2020. It's co-chaired by UNESCO, UIS, and ECW, the Education Cannot Wait Fund. And it has identified a number of functions for itself around strategy development and review, capacity development, resource mobilization, knowledge sharing and co-creation of solutions, and norm setting and advocacy. Next slide, around a few specific work streams. So these work streams have been identified by a consultation that we held in 2019 in Geneva with key EIE data stakeholders, to really try and set kind of an action agenda for us moving forward to strengthen the data ecosystem. So there are primary areas of work in the data reference group around global data reporting, data sharing, analysis, and use, strengthening joint monitoring, evaluation, and learning towards collective outcomes, and then data standards. All of this information is available on the INEE website. And if you're interested or want to learn more beyond what's available there, I would encourage you to reach out to myself. I'd be happy to discuss if you're interested in getting involved in this network space specifically. It is open. Definitely also encourage all of you to become INEE members. It's free if you are not already a member of INEE. So I hope that we've been able to highlight some potentially useful resources for those of you participating, and really encourage you to follow up if you do have questions. And I think Natalie is just going to speak to one more slide that we have. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Sonia pour cette grande présentation rapide de ce travail. Donc pour terminer, en fait, nous voulions, quand nous avons fait cette réflexion sur
Thank you, Sonia. To finish about the participation of the INEE and the work about research in Latin America, there are some questions. The audio conditions make our interpretation more difficult. So we have thought about the predominance of English in research currently, and the question is how to encourage research in French. And maybe we could have a debate about this. I'm sharing with you the webpage of the INEE. You can join us freely, as Sonia mentioned. Thank you, Maciel. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Sonia. It was very interesting to listen to your work. These are initiatives and institutions that want to encourage and promote participation and discussion. And it would be very good, as Joel mentioned before, doing this without any kind of Western frame, but we are here to debate, and at the end of this panel we will have a moment of Q's and A's, and Natalie will be able to answer to some of those questions. Thank you very much. We're going to continue with the third presentation of this panel that will be presented by KIX LAC Raúl Chacón, the director of KIX LAC. He's a sociologist of the Catholic University in Chile. He's got a master's degree from the Montreal University in Canada. And I'm going to participate in this presentation. I am Maciel Morales. I'm a KIX researcher. I have a PhD in research from the Sorbonne University. And we are going to present something titled The Teacher's Perspectives on Pandemic Practices, Challenges, and Learning. I give the floor to Raúl Chacón.
Thank you, Maciel. Thanks to Dr. Warwick and Sonia, Natalie. It's really great to hear these presentations. In honor to time, we'll try to do it as quick as possible, because of course we have a very interesting panel after this one. So I will start giving thanks to IDRC, our partners on this endeavor. OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, is with us today. GP, of course, the Global Partnership for Education, and in this opportunity as well, the IENEE, which is with us co-organizing this colloquium. Of course, all of you and the special greetings to our colleagues from the KIX countries. Just a brief slide that many of you already know about SUMA and KIX. We are the first education, research, and innovation laboratory for Latin America and the Caribbean. We are leading together with the OECS this KIX Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Initiative for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we share this mission related to the promotion of the right to education, quality, equity, and inclusion in our education systems through the mobilization of evidence to support informed decision-making processes at the local levels, but also at the structural national levels as well. As I said, we work with focus on some GPE country partners, which are Dominica, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Specifically, we are working really close with representatives from all the countries. But at the same time, we're working beyond, and we work with the region, and also we really like to bring the global perspective as well. So it's so interesting to hear the discussion about the mobilization of knowledge, evidence, and what does it mean, how we can address and use those evidence critically, appropriated, analyzing those findings, etc. So for that, we define three main objectives that are the main pillars of our work. Really brief. We work with the policy agenda that comes from the countries, and specifically we're discussing these days, this last month, and we're continuing with that, about teacher professional development, the impacts of COVID, and the strengthening of our public education systems. We mobilize knowledge for that. We like to discuss alternative solutions that are coming from outside of the region, but are from inside as well. So that's the critical perspective that we like to promote as well. And of course, we know that we need to foster capacity building. In this case, is so important to discuss about the capabilities that we have within the region on research specifically. Today we will focus and we will share the presentation with Maciel. I'll give the first part about an interesting effort initiative that we implemented together with the IDRC, GBE, and our colleagues from OECS in the countries in our region. We wanted to hear the voice of the teachers regarding about the effects or the perceptions they have in these days of pandemics. So some characteristic of the sample reached, we were really surprised with the participation. More than 200,000 teachers respond the questionnaire. The total here is 192,000 teachers is the valid information that we're using for for presenting these findings. So the high participation is the first thing that we would like to mention, and then the implementation. The survey was implemented between May and September, and we are now starting to present those findings. Of course, and it's really important to highlight the collaboration with ministries of education. This is on 21 countries. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean states, we work directly with OECS, and together we reach the countries. We work not only in dissemination, but also discussing the instrument, the pertinence of the questionnaire that we were implementing. So we will be sharing all of this very soon. We're almost finishing the report, but we have already some findings about it, and there are many opportunities to deepen the analysis at both the national and regional levels. Some countries have quite interesting numbers of teachers. In the case of OECS member states, we have the group of countries from the islands, and almost 800 teachers responded there. So one flag here is the red flag is that this is not representative survey. So this is a voluntary survey that almost 200,000 teachers responded. So there are interesting trends to analyze and to wait, of course, what those findings are saying. Many dimensions, some of the characteristics of the institutions, the teachers, but also others related to the challenges faced during the pandemic in terms of the pedagogical practices that teachers are using with the students, the relationships, and something really important, the well-being of teachers and students as well. In terms of gender, really quick, this is at the regional level. The sample reached almost more than 70% was female. In terms of the dependency of the teachers, the schools, most of them are coming from public schools. As you can see. In the case of the socioeconomic status of students, in average, more than 73% of the students are from medium, low, and low socioeconomic status, and that's really to have an idea of what we are discussing today. And what is interesting is that at the moment of when the teachers respond the survey, more than 73% of them, here are the totals of the teachers, were declared that they did a distance education, and another not minor is like 22% responded they did it in a hybrid way. So that's the composition of the survey. There are a few things about the students that we would like to highlight. The risk of exclusion in perception of the teachers is really hiked. The proportion of teachers, more than 50, almost 57% of the teachers that are highlighting this alert regarding to students. Regarding to learning loss, there is another interesting and alarming declaration that teachers are doing. In their perception, on average, only 7% believe that their students are not falling behind their learning. So it's important to highlight that 27% of the teachers are declaring that more than half of the students are behind. So this is something that we would like to highlight as well today. And another important thing regarding to the difficulties that the majority of the students would be facing in distance learning are related to, of course, as you can imagine, connectivity, internet problems, lacking electronic resources, and this is more pronunciated in when we control by socioeconomic status, as you can see. But also, and this is important in Summa, we as we were mentioning regarding the understanding of the human right as education as a human right, we need to not only see the biggest trends, but also to analyze what is happening. And we would like to concentrate the discussion as well in terms of what the teachers are saying, in terms of the problems that the students are facing. So the problems of motivation or depression are quite high. Interestingly, apparently there are not that many differences between socioeconomic status. And the other one, which is more alarming even, are the situations of domestic violence. More than 12% of the teachers that respond to the survey are declaring that there are situations of violence here. Regarding teachers, and then I will pass the floor to Maciel. Regarding teachers' labor satisfaction, we ask about their feeling about it, and they in general they are declaring satisfaction. They are satisfied or very satisfied in general, I would say. But here we would like to highlight those elements that appear less, where there is less satisfaction, and it's related to salary. Something that we push, we foster when we say the teachers are at the core of the work we're doing in education. We understand that other regions, when we look at the OECD member states, we can say that we will continue supporting this agenda as well, of course, and it relates to investment in our people. And finally, before Maciel takes the floor, we would like to highlight the main concerns of teachers by gender. And this is when you see, in general, you can see that the most mentioned are related to health. We're in pandemic, so we've been living through tough times, personal and family health. But then we would like to highlight the differences in gender, specifically in terms of the excessive amount of work, where females are much more concerned about it than males. And then regarding to the distribution of time between housework and work. So it's something that we have read already as some of the results of the pandemic, but here we are corroborating some with evidence, some kind of this kind of trends. So as quick as I could, Maciel, please, I give you the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, merci beaucoup, Raoul. Moi aussi, je vais essayer de passer assez vite. C'est beaucoup d'informations, c'est complètement intéressant.
Thank you very much, Raul. I'm going to go quickly. All this information is very interesting. And when we have asked with teachers regarding the program, the study program regarding on their social financial status, and talking about the current students to see what is the defined content or that they have taken on in a satisfactory way. And there's a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 was very little and 5 was completely covered for these different issues or these different classes. So we have something very interesting here, because there's the difference between the social economic level of the teachers who have answered and also the administration. So you can see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, you have private and charter school and public schools. So related to these results, we can say that the programs that are covered diminish regarding the social economic status. So it's clear that those from one social, a lower social economical status, they cover less subjects than those who have a more elevated social economic status. And evidently, it is very clear that the teachers that are public level have higher challenges regarding the carrying out of their classes regarding private schools in comparison, and we're having to do with the dynamic and prioritization of programs, having to do with the priority of the contents and how things were developed. And I think here it's very important because it's very interesting because the higher percentages having to do with distance education, there is an agreement between the different teachers, and that is the answer that is mostly mentioned. But also the fact that we carry it out individually, it has a higher percentage. And the teachers who say they had orientation by the team, from the curricular team, shows that they're lacking support regarding knowing what to prioritize in the curriculum, and the teachers had to agree amongst themselves or do it individually. So when we asked them regarding the strategies of recovery of learning, they asked what strategies they were using currently to be able to level the students to like up in the same level. And we can see here that the strategies that were used the most have to do with individual work of the students and also diagnosis evaluation. And it's interesting to mention how teachers took on this load, and they were able to establish individual work with each student. So they established the tools for this teaching and with what frequency they use certain tools to teach. That was the following question. So as we could have expected, we have the digital platform with a role that is very important with the online classes and with this digital attendance or assistance with the different platforms and with everything that has to do with these tools and other hybrid ones as well. And also the fact that there is an impression by paper and also communication through television and radio that was used. And regarding with the digital is also very important, but it's not the only tool that is used in our territory. So regarding the level of preparation of the teachers for the distance for training to be able to teach online, and we can see here regarding the different countries having to do with data, the perception of the teachers. This is the teacher's perception. We can see very important differences regarding each country. And we can also underline that there is a percentage that is pretty high of teachers who feel like they are prepared for distance teaching. And in the end here, when we ask them regarding the difficulties in the development of their teaching tasks, we could perceive that the difficulties were basically the connectivity and access to internet were the main ones, but it also caught our attention the lack of motivation and that the students would not be connected in class, would disconnect. So basically the question is, how can we ensure a good environment, a motivational environment to be able to carry out distance teaching? So I'm going to give the word back now to Raul for the last part.
Thanks, Marcel. Just to finalize with a few words and reflections about what we're presenting. Definitely, we see opportunities for further analysis and research. So that's the first thing that we would like to highlight. There is a rich data coming here that could be used at the local, national, regional level. The data sets are going to be shared as well. So opportunities there are some qualitative analysis that could be done even with the survey, but to go deep in the analysis. Some specific contributions that we would like to highlight is the need to ensure access and quality education, responding these problems that we identified as lack of motivation, depression of students, risk of exclusion, dropout, situations of violence is something that we really would like to highlight. Of course, the well-being of teachers and students are at the core of our efforts in the educational system. So to reinforce that idea as well. In this new era, we are highlighting as well the pedagogical use of the information and communication technologies as a necessary tool for these new scenarios. More focused on investment and training, we want to highlight. Strengthening teacher support system is something that we have been working in the KIX in SUMA with OECS as well. The discussion about the career conditions, the professional development, in-service, pre-service, and of course there are many challenges there as well. And finally, we would like to reinforce the need for strengthening the public education systems in our region, and especially in those disadvantaged populations that are at the core of our work. Well, thank you very much, and let's continue this conversation and other presentations.
Merci beaucoup, Raoul, et merci à tous les chercheurs et chercheuses de cette première panel. C'était vraiment intéressant.
Thank you to all the researchers in this first panel. Everything was very interesting, and I would like to ask a first question to open the conversation, because listening to these presentations, I thought about reflecting regarding the challenges of research in the regions. For example, when we talked about that we need to expose or share those things that we have talked about regarding your experience. What are the mechanisms and the strategies that you can conceive regarding research in the different regions, and regarding the discussion that was here in the chat as well, which allows us to establish this research that is without criticism, without this imposition having to do with the West? So how can we create these moments to be able to establish a participative research that is territorial? I don't know if maybe Dr. Rorican would like to answer this to begin.
Yes, thanks a lot, Maciel. Now, the challenge, so we talk about the Western frames and the constraints that we have when research is done through these Western lenses. And the question is always asked, so how do we combat that? You know, I think that's really the heart of the thing. How do we combat it? I believe that we have got to be very smart and strategic about it. We've got to recognize the world that we are living in, and that we cannot minimize the importance of the Western world. We cannot look at it that we are going, you know, on our own separate ways, because quite often you will be marginalized. So the thing is, how do you use the West to articulate the work that you are doing and to do the work that you want to do. I think that really is the key. And there's some things that I believe that needs to be done. I think the first thing is that it is always good to build a community. And that community can be persons who are local, regional, but there are persons, there are people in the Western world who very much have an understanding of what we are trying to do and are good allies who we can team up with to work with. So I think it's important that we do not reject persons in the West to work with. Maybe when they have misconceptions, we can help them to clear up those misconceptions and put them on the right path. I think also as we do research, we cannot, and I think I saw Joseph, Lefranc Joseph mentioned something about how the local can, the Western frames can still co-opt the local research, and that is very true. So I like to say, do not think that you, a local researcher, is immune from the biases, because many of us have been trained through those same Western frames. We have gone to Western universities, we've gone to the UK, to the US, to France, and so forth to study. And so we have those things embedded in us. So what I encourage is that for us to become reflexive, we need to learn how to reflect on our own practice, on our own way of doing, you know? So we ourselves must be reflexive. One of the things that I've been doing recently, I've been working with some colleagues in the US and Canada, and they have brought me on as a mentor. But I see myself more, these are people from the Caribbean and other non-Western countries. I am serving more as what I call a critical friend to them. So when I read their research, the writing up of their research, or when I look at what they're doing, I'm able to say, have you considered this? Have you considered that? Have you criticizing about the Western world that you yourself is imposing that same thing on your participants? So have been as getting a critical friend. And just a few more things. Highlighting issues and challenges in doing your study. So as you write up your study, you have got to be able to share with the Western world that as we did this research in the Caribbean, as we did this research in Latin America, here are some things to consider. Here are some things that we found challenging. Do not know the challenges and not share them. We have got to share.
You're mute, Joel. Your microphone is mute now.
Oh, it just got muted, I imagine.
Yes.
Right. The last thing I would say is that be prepared, colleagues, to use Western mechanisms to get our message. Sometimes when we talk about decolonizing,
Again,
I'm not sure, I'm not even touching anything. Yes, sometimes when we try to decolonize, what we do, we end up rejecting everything in the Western world, and we reject their journals, and we try to develop our own journals. It is important that we develop our own journals, but we want to share our work also with them. So we need to be prepared to learn to play the game of the West and get into those journals also, along with our own local journals. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why it's keep muted.
No.
No idea what is happening, just to check.
Merci beaucoup.
No, it's
What is
the
happening
system is
now?
muted. Florencio, can you speak? Because Florencio is asking for the. But I don't know.
No.
Joel, because Joel wanted to wrap up the idea, but it was muted for some reason. Florencio.
Okay, I think the point is really made already. So I'm fine.
Excellent. Thanks, Joel. Florencio, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I wanted to wade into that. I find fascinating discussion on decolonization and research. This is something that, as you know, IDRC faces or struggle with or think about, to put it in positive terms, permanently. Our mandate is to support research done in the South by Southern organizations and bring this knowledge into the global arena. And by doing that, there are many spaces in which the discussion on decolonization is present. And when it comes to how actually you respond to that, I mean, how do you translate this more than valid criticism into something operational? How do you actually do different, considering the framework in which we move in terms of how research today is financed and how some knowledge is validated, whether other is not in practical terms? So this is a question that we face quite often and we discuss quite. What do you do based on that for an organization that overall believes on research and knowledge generated by the South, which is, you can say anyway, a questionable term, as anyone referring to this sort of separation, I guess. And there are a few things that we have been trying to do. I would like to mention very quickly those, and I also would like to mention some red flags anyway. Yes, at least in KIX, at least in IDRC in general, we have been consistent in the sense that what we are interested is research done in the South and by local organizations. This is not just a political statement. We believe that you do better science when it comes to science related with development and applied science, when this science is done by actors that actually have an understanding more nuanced of the local realities, a more permanent grip and commitment with changing political conditions and policy conditions based on this knowledge, and are able to collect or to consider what local priorities are, which is always difficult to do. We have been trying to do that, for instance, when it comes to our regional grants, by using OECS and SUMA as a way to capture, in an imperfect way, of course, local priorities and national priorities. I think there is also a statement regarding the type of research you can do. Usually the global arena, let's say the large forums, are quite fond of very limited types of research, RCTs in particular, randomized control tests, which are expensive, are long, and not many institutions can afford it. One of our challenges throughout the years has been, how do you give the same status to other type of research results? And I'm thinking, for instance, in more qualitative, applied, ground-based research, participatory research that produce a very important amount of results, but usually the same study is not attributed compared with, like, okay, here is my RCT on that particular topic. And we have been trying to define some strategy. I mean, we have been developing some strategies in order to do that. One of those strategies, for instance, is that we realized that in order to give the same prestige, the same status to local quality research, you need to create some critical mass. So in order to bring that into some debates, you can't just have one case study in each country. You need to bundle together a number of studies that are sort of pointing out on the same directions, all from this sort of more grounded perspective. So I think that that's something important. I'm not saying that all local research or decolonized research or sounder-based research has to do quality. But the matter of fact is that most of this research works at local levels and do not have the same type of resources, and still is good science. And I think that there is also something that Professor Warrican mentioned. It has to do with this idea of open science. Not only open journals or alternative journals to the one that sort of are the most respected or more recognized one. I think that is beyond that, is about how do you actually promote open science? Not only open journals, also open data, and open content and open access to that research. So this is all part of this effort. Now, and with that I will finalize. I think that the risk, and I think that Professor Warrican flagged that or framed that in a good way, is that this distinction that we can theoretically question what exactly means the colonization of that. I think that if you go and do a sort of double click on this, there is an existing debate worldwide on what does it mean, and that debate has changed throughout the last 30, 40 years. But still, I think that what we need to be careful is not to indulge into eliminating standards for this sort of sounder-based, decolonized, let's say, research. How do you make sure that that doesn't turn into a sort of anti-science type of discourse? And it's easy for that to happen, and we are facing these sort of discourses in other areas of our development. So I think it's important to still consider, how do you make our methods, how do you make our frameworks accountable with good, trustable knowledge, despite everything, so we do not sort of hide beyond this discourse that is absolutely valid and necessary, the need for good quality evidence that can inform local policies in the South. I don't think there is a easy fix of that, but I don't think that it helps to just consider one part of it. So I like a lot what Joel was presenting. If we are able to put it in that framework, that's what I wanted to say, because this is something that, as I said, we have been facing and discussing in IDRC on different areas, not only in education, for a very long time, because it affects the core of what we try to do. Thank you.
You're mute, Marcel.
Merci beaucoup, Florencio, por ton intervención. Encore c'est moi. Je sais pas
Muchísimas gracias, Florencio. Sonia or Natalie, would you like to share your reflection about this? About these topics, about the difficulties of carrying research?
Sorry, I'm trying to get the question. I heard the difficulties of carrying research, which I don't think I fully understand. So apologies, I'm dealing with the translation a little bit. I don't know if it's possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Désolée. On réfléchit par rapport à les difficultés de la...
This is about the difficulties that research has of carrying a research in the Central and Caribbean region. What are the solutions, the ways to deepen and work together in order to have this research, or to carry this research with a territorial view based on the characteristics of every country?
Okay, I think the translation might still be slightly confusing, so apologies if I'm not fully answering the question. I know that Natalie had to hop off, so it's just me now, but I really would just build on what we shared in terms of INEE. I think the way that we are starting to try and address this is, of course, through our network spaces and by convening members at this national or regional level around key questions of evidence production, dissemination, identification of evidence gaps. So ensuring that research agendas are not driven by Northern or Western institutions, and that practitioners commissioners, policymakers, academics at a national need to engage, I guess, with the West as well. It's an interesting one, and is quite
Sonia,
Sonia, on a des soucis techniques.
I think you have problems of connection now. I think it's happening today. There are some problems of connection. Yes, we lost Sonia. So I think, Maciel, maybe we could just close this panel and continue. Really interesting conversation. Really interesting conversation. Just to highlight one point regarding the work we do, trying to connect those local, national priorities efforts with what could happen at the regional level, but also informed by the global evidence, what's happening in other regions in different kind of contexts. Our main challenge and effort is regarding to contextualization of what we do within the region, when we work with the Eastern Caribbean, when we work with the Central America or South America. That's the main challenge, but we completely share the idea that this is driven by high quality standards, and that's something that we would like to reinforce. That we really push for that high quality standards, and we need to discuss about methodologies, about robust data, and so on and so forth. So Sonja, we missed you, but maybe you would like to wrap up, and because we would like to close for the next.
I think we can move on, and just apologies for the connectivity issues. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Maciel, please.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, on va faire une
Muchísimas. Thank you so much. We're going to have a pause of 5 minutes. And I want to thank all the researchers. It was very interesting. We could continue talking about these topics for a long time, and we're going to have a very short break for 5 minutes, and we're going to continue then with our next panel. Thank you so much.
Okay, colleagues. Can you hear me? Marcel, can you hear me? Yeah, excellent. So we will continue with the second panel. It's called Territorial Experiences of Educational Research in Emergency and Crisis Situations. This panel will be facilitated by Judy-Ann Allison. Thank you, Judy-Ann. Judy-Ann Allison Odd is the principal of a special education institution on her island in Grenada. She began her teaching career at the age of 16 years old. 5 years later, she graduated with a certificate in primary education from the University of West Indies and was also awarded a certificate for outstanding performance in teacher education. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Educational Leadership and Management with honors from the same university, her Master's in Inclusive Special Education from the University of Roehampton, London, and she's currently she's pursuing a doctoral degree in education with concentration in special and inclusive education. Judy-Ann, please welcome. The floor is yours and have a great panel as well.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Raul, and good morning to everybody. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Today's discussion proposes to reflect on the emergencies and crises of various kinds that have occurred and/or are occurring in the region and how they affect our country's education. Considering that the territories of Central America and the Caribbean have been affected by natural disasters and many crises, particularly the health crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have invited our presenters today to discuss how education and the teaching methods have had to evolve, mutate, and adapt due to this phenomenon. To this end, 3 thematic lines were proposed: professional development of teachers, COVID-19 and educational challenges, and strengthening public education. Our panelists for the second panel discussion will present on the broader theme, territorial experiences of educational research in emergency and crisis situations. Our esteemed panelists today are Dr. Verna Knight, Dr. Shemaine Bissessa, Dr. Adelia Ferdinand, and Dr. LeFrance Joseph. Each panelist will present for 15 minutes, and at the end of the presentations, we will have a time for discussion and questions. I'm kindly requesting that we try to respect the time allotted for each presentation. I will post a raise hand emoji to indicate when it's time for the presenters to wrap up the session. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Verna Knight. Dr. Knight has been an educator for over 20 years and holds a doctoral degree in education, policy, and planning with special emphasis on the Eastern Caribbean area. She is a full-time lecturer with the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus with responsibility for the delivery and assessment of educational programs in social studies and social context and education policy at the bachelor's and postgraduate levels. She is also the coordinator for the Bachelor of Education program, the subject coordinator for social studies, geography, and history with the Eastern Caribbean Joint Board of Teacher Education, and the assistant coordinator for the Caribbean Education Research Center. At the regional level, she is part of the operational team at the Caribbean Center for Education Planning and has been providing support to the OECS Education Development Management Unit in its management of the implementation of OECS education sector strategy in OECS member states since 2012. I now present Dr. Verna Knight. Dr. Knight.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you so much for the invitation to share on research this morning, and it's still morning. I hope you can see my presentation clearly.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. So I want to begin by sharing somewhat a bit about the context for the research itself. My topic is In School, but Struggling for Success, Critical Barriers to Learning for All Caribbean Schools. Now, the provision of a basic education for every child has generally been accepted by most countries as a key 21st century goal. The 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, for example, and its mandate for education for all, articulated in Article 6, represented a pivotal achievement in the age-old struggle for us in terms of achieving or establishing the right to a free education for all children. And global progress on implementing this goal, especially in developing countries across the world, has been especially significant within the last 2 decades. And this progress has been largely achieved through collaborative commitments and efforts that are evident beginning from the World Declaration on Education established in Jamsi in Thailand in 1990, followed by the Dhaka Framework in Senegal 2000, Millennium Development Goals, and even more recently, the Education 2030 Incheon Declaration. However, along with these reports of increasing access, there has been a growing concern for student learning and an increasing acknowledgement that while the two terms, that is schooling and education, may be frequently used interchangeably by us, the provision of schooling does not necessarily guarantee the receipt of a quality education. Global reports over the last decade have especially confirmed that while the provision of access to schooling facilitates the pathway to obtaining an education, schooling does not automatically translate into learning, and therefore educational access cannot be assumed to mean educational success for every child. Efforts to increase access to education in the past have often reflected a tendency to focus on schooling and enrollment numbers because these indicators are more tangible, and counting the number of children in school tends to be an easier measurement of educational progress and achievement than trying to determine how many students are actually learning. Data trends over the last decade and a half especially show us that there is a minority group of students inhibited in every school from attaining educational success because of a very number of barriers to learning. Now, the Center for Global Development in 2013 described this trend as one that is indicative of a growing or an increasing schooling learning gap. More recently, the term learning poverty is being used by the World Bank to refer to the same phenomenon. And the concept of learning poverty and the subsequent measures of this indicator generally focuses on the number of students who are unable or unable to read and understand a simple text by the age of 10. When we consider this issue a bit more broadly, the concept emphasizes the need for a dual focus on schooling and learning by focusing both on children who have achieved the minimum proficiency levels, as well as children who have not attained these minimum proficiency levels. And as such, for us to distinguish between children who are schooling deprived, that is those children who are out of school or excluded completely from education, and those children who are learning deprived, that is those children who are accessing school but achieving below minimum proficiency levels. And so undergirding my presentation this morning and this research is a conceptual notion of inclusive education. And the notion of inclusion and inclusive education is really a fairly recently accepted construct, which has added a particularly new dimension to considerations of effective schooling provisions within the last 2 decades. UNESCO in 2005 defined inclusion as being a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of the needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures and communities, and reducing exclusion within and from education. When the term inclusion or inclusive education is used, you tend to find that many people quickly infer a reference to special needs education or education for special needs or education for students with disabilities. And this is because The initial research and discussion in earlier years on inclusion in education have traditionally been presented through a disability lens. This limited conceptualization of inclusion, however, is far from being true today. Although the reality in schools may at times disprove this, the inclusion debate has since evolved from an initial focus on the provisions for special education needs to supplement, as a supplement that is to general education provisions, to advocacy for the integration of students with disabilities into mainstream education, and generally embracing school and pedagogical reform, which is positively responsive, not just to students with disabilities, but to student diversity on a whole, seeing individual differences as opportunities for enriching learning rather than as problems to fix. And so inclusion implies, therefore, that if successful participation becomes an issue for any student, be it for reasons related to gender, disability, behavior, poverty, culture, refugee status, or any other reason, that the desirable approach should be to expand mainstream thinking, mainstream structures and practices, so that all students are accommodated. In other words, inclusion refers to the removal of barriers which exclude and marginalize students. This particular research was engaged in these 7 participating Caribbean countries that you see listed on the screen, predominantly the Eastern Caribbean region. And across these countries, there is a general commitment to the right to an education for every child. And this support is articulated in most of the education documents, inclusive of the OECS Regional Education Strategic Plan, which highlights every learner succeeding as the overarching goal for education within the sub-region. And so education is therefore perceived as being critical to individual, national, and regional development. And government's typical annual budget on education can amount to some 11.6% at a regional level. Also key to note within this sub-region remains a significant gap in terms of the levels of teachers trained and certified for classroom practice. While this has been improving, the percentage of trained teachers at the primary level still remains at some 26%, while at the secondary level, some 39 to 40%. Additionally, one World Bank report in 2013, and subsequently we've had other reports do the same, noted that despite the relatively high level of investment in education across the region, the quality of education remains low and leaves significant room for improvement. In fact, when we look at the average pass rates for standardized tests in core subjects like English and mathematics that are often taken by the majority of students within a cohort, you often find that often less than 50% of the cohorts sitting these exams will pass. And so we know that there are particular challenges. When we look at, for example, the measure of CSEC, which we use to gauge success at the end of secondary level, and we look at the OECS, for example, in terms of the number of students who attain 5 CSEC subjects, inclusive of math and English, between 2011 to 2017, we saw it was way below 50%. Generally, around a percentage of 42, 43% of the cohort of students in any given year. And so these, of course, give us insight into cause for concern. Now, UNICEF and UIS have jointly led what we refer to as Global Out-of-School Children Initiatives since 2010. And this study and the research findings in this presentation emerged from a broader out-of-school children study within the Eastern Caribbean region completed in 2017. It was supported by UNICEF Eastern Caribbean Office, and these studies tend to examine the status of exclusion of children in developing countries and the reasons behind such exclusion within each particular context. They tend to measure both children who are physically out of school and children in school, but who may be experiencing difficulties. As I noted, and I want to highlight even more closely, the collaboration was one that existed between the School of Education, UWI, UNICEF Eastern Caribbean Office, OECS, as well as UIS and an organization out of Argentina known as Educación para Todos. Now, the findings from this report noted that while total exclusion from education is not a significant issue for the Eastern Caribbean region, potential exclusion is. And this constitutes some 17% at the primary level, represented by dimension 4, and some 33% at the secondary level, represented by dimension 5. And this represents, in essence, students who are enrolled in schooling, but who are having difficulty progressing or achieving much success despite the access granted. And so the research is undergirded by the key question of what are the most critical issues which constitute barriers for these students, that this minority, this one third, who may be experiencing difficulties. As I mentioned or I hinted at earlier, the study had 2 phases. Phase 1, it is based on an explanatory mixed method design. Phase 1 engaged a collection of administrative data from statistical offices across the 7 territories. And then in phase 2, we engaged countries in a 2-day session with educational stakeholders, interrogating the issue of why. Why are these students having particular difficulties? And this was done through questionnaires as well as focus group sessions with these persons. Now, this slide here presents a summative snapshot of the situation with potential exclusion across the Caribbean countries studied. And the visual gives you an idea as to where the trend is going. On average, potential exclusion at the kindergarten level ranged from 8% to 15%, at the grade 6 level from 8 to 32%, or at the sub-regional level, an average of 25% for the grade 6 level. At the first form level, it was somewhat an average, well, at the second form level, sorry, an average of some 38%. And so what can be noted, especially by the visual on my right, is somewhat of a cumulative increase in the number of children reported as experiencing difficulties with academic success in schools at each of those key points in education. And so the consultation was aimed at examining the why. And these are just some pictures taken of the teachers in session. I want to share via this particular slide some of what the quantitative data to begin with provided us with in terms of insights. The quantitative data helped to narrow the issues affecting student success to 4 primary, or what we refer to as critical barriers. Based on a rating scale of 1 to 5, with 5 representing very problematic and 1 representing not a problem at all, primary issues were categorized as all those issues scoring a mean of 4 to 5, with the highest possible being, of course, 5. 4 issues emerged as the most highly rated issues inhibiting student learning overall, and were categorized as primary issues within those scores of 4 to 5, means of 4 to 5. Predominantly, inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners, weak boys' participation and performance relative to girls, low parental involvement in education, and inadequate support for students with special needs. Now, when compared across school levels, the secondary school level reflected the highest number of primary issues. All 5 were reflected at the secondary level. At the primary school level, however, only 1 of the 4 issues emerged as a primary issue, that is inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners. And at the early childhood level, only 2 of the 4 issues emerged as primary. They were inadequate support for students with special needs and inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners. Now, in the short remaining time I have, I want to quickly provide you with some brief insight into these issues, the nature of these issues. Now, the main themes which emerge from the qualitative data to describe the nature of the problems regarding inadequate general learning supports was summarized under 4 broad headings: weaknesses in instructional practices, inadequate remedial support for learners, inadequate use of student assessment data to guide efforts for student improvement, and counter-supportive administrative school policies. When we talk about counter-supportive administrative processes, these include instances where class retention or repetition is practiced, but when it is done without mandatory remediation support for addressing the learning gaps for those students who would have been retained. Also, in most countries, there was a common practice of social promotion or an up and out policy, which meant that many students who were of an official grade age were being promoted to the subsequent class level despite performing below grade level standards. There was also the absence of additional teaching and learning support for schools which received the most academically weak students, and large class sizes at the secondary levels, which made it very difficult for a single teacher to provide general and specific supports to the weaker students within a limited class period or time. Then there was the whole issue of boys' participation relative to girls. And the themes which emerged from the qualitative data to describe the nature of these problems were categorized under 4 main themes. The first was, of course, consistently weaker academic performance results from boys relative to girls, earlier school leaving among boys relative to girls, gender biases in teaching, and higher reports of disciplinary and behavioral punishments relative to girls. In terms of gender biases, participants explained that the teaching force was mostly comprised of female teachers, and the data represents that. There were very few male teachers who could serve as positive male authority figures for boys. There were gender biases evident in teaching practices and teaching styles, which often didn't include those practical activities that research tell us are suited, especially preferred by boys. There were socio-cultural beliefs which have traditionally allowed for a more permissive learning style for boys relative to girls. And in relation to the reports of disciplinary and behavioral punishments, there were relatively higher reports among boys of incidents of suspensions from school, in-school detentions, and missed classes, which often set them back further in terms of their academic progress. And of course, more male students were being reported as exhibiting behavioral problems and thus being punished than girls. As it relates to the whole notion of low parental engagement and involvement, the themes which emerged were categorized under 3 broad headings: poorly involved parents, which is almost self-explanatory, poor parental communication with schools, between the teachers and between the schools and the homes, and negative attitudes and perceptions by parents towards parental involvement. And what is interesting about this particular one is that this issue emerged as a primary issue only at the secondary level. At the primary level, parental involvement only emerged as a secondary issue with means of 3.5 to 3.9, while at the early childhood level, it was not an issue at all. And we found that to be very interesting. And the final one is the whole notion of inadequate special needs provisions. And the main themes which emerged from the qualitative data to describe the nature of the problems in this area were categorized under 4 broad headings: late or delayed detection and identification of special needs in children, low academic expectation of students with special needs, inadequate infrastructural school level provisions for those students, and inadequate specialist supports for students with special needs. Now, I want to conclude with just a few remarks as it relates to the implications of this research for policy and practices moving forward. First of all, we noted a cumulative trend in relation to the severity of these issues, which appear to relatively worsen at each subsequent educational level, with the greatest intensity being recorded at the secondary school level, which is the final and highest level of compulsory schooling for most countries in the region. This cumulative nature of the difficulties experienced by students is an important observation to highlight for 2 reasons. First of all, these issues can and are serving to undermine education quality for a minority group of students accessing schooling and who are being promoted through the system despite their non-achievement of the minutes. And secondly, the cumulative nature of these primary issues affecting student success indicates that relevant systematic interventions are needed, but should not be targeted at any one specific school level, such as the secondary level where the problems appear to be mostly the greatest, but rather supportive learning interventions are needed at each of the education system levels, beginning from early childhood levels where the weaknesses are first noticed. And so deliberate efforts to monitor and strengthen teaching and learning at the point of entry into schooling at the kindergarten levels, and to increase accountability for learning success by all have to be emphasized as new 21st century mandate for all teachers and education leaders. Then there is a gendered issue, gendered success as an issue. The research notes that whereas at the end of the 19th century and especially in the 1960s, the educational disadvantages of women were central to debates surrounding gender and academic achievement, By the end of the 20th century, and certainly within the 21st century, the attention has now turned to boys. While large-scale studies have been reported in the region in Latin America and the Caribbean, and have shown very little difference in performance between boys and girls, that is between in the OECD and Latin America, the results from the OECS, or the Eastern Caribbean region, emphasize that boys are twice as likely to perform poorly on average than girls. Thirdly, the need for strengthening schools' capacity for supporting weaker learners. The observation from the findings was that generally, with the exception of parental involvement, most of the primary issues affecting student success were located at the school level and could be addressed through a sustained emphasis on strengthening teacher and teaching quality in schools. The identified primary issues point to a need for strengthening teacher development and school leadership, given the kind of difficulties that students are having. And finally, the results are supportive of a recharacterization somewhat of students at risk for our particular context. The findings regarding the primary issues inhibiting learning for Caribbean students, that minority, similarly to international school improvement research findings, emphasize a multiplicity in the nature of the factors that affect student achievement overall, and which explains low student performance specifically. And so the findings support that the overarching conclusion, it supports the overarching conclusion that is that poor academic student achievement isn't a result of a single risk factor, but rather a combination and accumulation of various barriers and disadvantages affecting students throughout their lives. However, while like an OECD student, most at risk might be characterized as being from a socioeconomically disadvantaged home, or being a girl living in a single parent family environment in a rural area, or being a child from an immigrant background, within the Eastern Caribbean region, a Caribbean at risk child might perhaps best be characterized by the primary issues we are seeing arising from the study. Being a student in need of remedial learning support for a variety of reasons, being a male student experiencing difficulties in academics, being a student with a special need, or being a student with weak parental involvement and support at home. The good news, when one considers the nature of these risk factors, what becomes obvious is that they are not insurmountable and they are not new, but rather they point to typical supports that we should be providing to support the success of all children in schools. And so my final statement is this. This research supports a comprehensive re-evaluation of existing educational supports for students' success in Caribbean schools, especially given the inclusive educational context to which Caribbean schools and education systems now subscribe. I thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Knight. In Dr. Knight's presentation, in her introduction, she highlighted some policies worldwide that can really, basically policies from international and world perspective that emphasizes the right to basic education for every child. But my takeaway from Dr. Knight's presentation are provision of schooling doesn't guarantee quality of education for every child, and being in school doesn't equate to learning. Thank you so much, Dr. Knight, and we'll have some time after the end of all 4 presentations for question and answers. At this time, let me present our second presenter, and she is Dr. Charmaine Bissessa. Dr. Charmaine Bissessa is currently the acting director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and she functions as the director of Educational Online Support System. She is also the senior lecturer with the University of Guyana, where she lectures in education at the master's and postgraduate levels. She's also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Dr. Bissessa has presented at conferences regionally and globally, and has written extensively on leadership in education, focusing on gender. Her publications add to the limited extant research on anecdotal and empirical data on the Caribbean. I present to you Dr. Bissessar. You're muted. Can you unmute, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. This afternoon, I will be presenting on the coping mechanisms of 2 Grenadian school teachers during the pandemic. And what caused me to do this study is my concern with what was happening within the region vis-a-vis teachers being able to cope with teaching during the pandemic. So I would now like to underscore the problem that resulted in the purpose of the study. So the Grenadian Ministry of Education, according to KIX LAC in 2021, reported that 63% of students were unable to access emergency remote classes at the closure of schools due to a lack of devices and access to internet. Similarly, in 2020, the Chaise Matin explained at the seminal stages of the pandemic, OECS member states were confronted with the stark reality that not all communities have access to affordable internet and not all students have access to suitable devices. The Chaise Matin also indicated that given that an estimated 30% of children lack electronic devices and access to online learning, the program with the member states would help to procure and distribute devices to at least 12,000 vulnerable primary school students across Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. Therefore, with that in mind, the purpose of this study was to determine what has been done and is being done in the Grenadian classrooms to cope with the pandemic. Therefore, the research question was, what have Grenadian teachers done to cope with the pandemic during in the last 2 years? And this study is significant in that it would show us some of the issues and the coping mechanisms that Grenadian teachers are using and have been using to mitigate learning loss. This study is also significant in that it corroborates a previous study I conducted in Grenada, Trinidad, and Guyana on the issues and challenges facing teachers during the pandemic. So my conceptual framework, this is my conceptual framework. And as you can see, we have the coping mechanisms. Out of the coping mechanisms, we have access to resources, and we have devices plus training, and we have parental involvement, and we have lack of or too much of. And then you have students' ability to cope with online classes, teaching strategies implemented, advice to teachers, and lessons learned. In the essence of time, I will not go through everything, but as you can see here, in California, US, Grenada, Guyana, administrators or education ministries were able during the pandemic to disseminate devices to the more marginalized and vulnerable populations. So these were ways in which they attempted to mitigate learning loss. So also parental involvement was a critical point. And in some areas, parents felt overburdened with the added responsibility of having to motivate their students, having to discipline their students, and having their children, and having to ensure that the children attend classes. In other studies, it was found that parents were very much involved in their children's studies. However, in some areas, there was a lack of involvement. And I can go on to all of these, but I am thinking of time, but the important one is the teaching strategies. A lot of teachers implemented games and gamification in order to ensure that they were engaging their students, and they were also allowing for more interactions within the online synchronous and asynchronous settings. So the methodology, this is a descriptive phenomenology where the lived experience of participants were captured. I created a questionnaire with a Google link, and I placed it in the Grenadian teachers Facebook page called Heart to Heart on the 17th of February 2022. And by the 27th of March 2022, only 2 persons had responded. So I know the study is limited by the number of participants. This was a purposive sampling study where only persons who were a part of that Facebook page took part in the study. Now, when I coded the data, I attempted to code the data, although there was not much data since we only had 2 participants. I found that these were some of the issues. So for example, access to resources. One participant indicated that devices were given to students and teachers so that synchronous sessions could take place online. She stated that students have been given tablets and teachers computers to assist with online learning, which takes place in the form of Zoom classes. Participant 2, however, was more concerned about training, where she talked about the fact that they were given devices, but they were also, as she said here, teaching the students how to use the gadgets for education, getting some training myself. So she also was able to attend training and get training. She said at the beginning it was difficult, but there were opportunities available for training and teaching remotely, and she was able to capitalize on those opportunities. I want to also interject here that I interviewed them at the start of the pandemic, which would have been in March 2020. And the confidence with which they responded now versus at the start of it is clearly obvious. And parental involvement. Participant 1 said she has been coping well. However, she feels despondent when parents are not assisting their children in the way they should. However, participant 2 had the opposite effect, where she said grades and assignments do not reflect students' true performance. Their parents are the ones taught because they do the work, not the students. So we have both ends of the continuum being expressed here. And students' ability to cope with the online classes. Participant 1 talked about the fact that most of them were able to cope eventually. However, that human connection, they missed the physical contact and the human connection. And she said, in my case, we are now back to face-to-face classroom and are gradually getting back into some form of normalcy. So initially they missed the face-to-face contact. Participant 2 also said at the beginning, they were shocked and overwhelmed. Now I think they can cope much better. However, they are easily distracted. So what I found in all my interviews with teachers, there was an issue with getting students to be engaged, getting them to interact, and the issue of distraction came up several times. Teaching strategies implemented. Participant would talk about the fact that she used Zoom classes, videos, playing games online, doing virtual field trip. And participant 2 talked about gamification and using a lot of visual and interactive activities. So they both attempted as much as possible to engage their students. Now, I asked them about some advice they would give to teachers now that they have transitioned from online or emergency remote teaching and learning to face-to-face. And participant 1 stated, have a positive attitude towards change. Take care of yourself, enhance modern technology, and embrace all opportunities to succeed. Participant 2 said, educate yourself on using technology in teaching. Carry out research because there's quite a lot of information out there. Be the change, be willing to change your approach to teaching. And what were some lessons learned during the pandemic? Participant 1 stated that the 3 lessons learned during the pandemic were: never take anything in life for granted, change can come in a split second, and learn to adapt in adverse situations. Participant 2 shared that students are in the online class, they may appear to be paying attention to you, but they are chatting with each other. Do not take things for granted. Many students do not know how to use their tablets for educational purposes. So both participants underscore the importance of not taking anything for granted. And with that, I would like to talk about the discussion and how some of this information corroborates or validates what is what is available in the literature, scholarly literature. So as you can see, students in Grenada and other OECS islands and developed countries were given devices during the pandemic. In Grenada, devices were also given to teachers, which is reflected by the participants' responses in this study. Training was also conducted by educators in Ukraine, Greece, Guyana, and Grenada. Parental involvement in this study also reflects conclusions drawn by other researchers who reported lack of parental involvement or too much parental involvement. And students reported that the use of gamification as an instructional delivery tool enhanced their motivation and decreased their feelings of isolation. So in conclusion, it remains to be seen how this 2-year shift to emergency remote education has affected teachers' instructional delivery and what tools they will add to their face-to-face pedagogical repertoire and what tools they will eliminate. The findings in this study cannot be generalized to a larger population. However, they are similar to conclusions drawn in an earlier study by me on Grenadian teachers' views on what is happening in the classroom at the start of the pandemic. With that, this is my bibliography, and I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research.
Thank you, Dr. DeSessa. Thank you so much for sharing with us some of the coping strategies that Grenadian teachers used during the pandemic. And I want to highlight here that at the beginning, 63% of students in Grenada lacked devices and access to the internet. However, devices were provided for both teachers and students by the government, but there was also the issue of the teachers being trained to use the device and also being able to teach their students how to use the devices. Thank you again for your presentation. Our third presenter today is Dr. Idalia Ferdinand. And Dr. Ferdinand is a senior education officer in the Ministry of Education and National Reconciliation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She has responsibility for research and school safety. She has over 20 years of experience in disaster management through her involvement as a member of the Cadet Force in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Ferdinand holds a PhD in disaster management and sustainable development at Northumbria University, United Kingdom, a master's by research in disaster management from Coventry University, United Kingdom, and a bachelor's of arts in geography at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. She has been involved with the school safety agenda in SVG since October 2013, and has also been involved in promoting the Caribbean Safe School Initiative regionally and internationally. I now hand you over to Dr. Ferdinand.
A pleasant good morning, and thank you for having me. This presentation is a review of SVG's multi-hazard experience over the last few years, the impact on the education sector in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the opportunities that were created for building the resilience of the education sector. This is a collaboration between myself and my colleague, Kathy Badnock. Okay, so the presentation will focus on introduction, looking at our hazard proneness, the impact of hazards, focusing on the education sector, what were our responses, the lessons that we learned, and the future of education in terms of building resilience. Now, we are well aware that the Caribbean is considered one of the most hazard-prone region in the world, and we face many challenges, including hurricanes, which we experience annually, storms, floods, drought, landslides, earthquake, volcanic eruption, and we have health risk and the new and emerging ones such as COVID-19. And while these experiences, the experiences from the impact of hazards would disrupt our learning, we are well aware that all is not lost and we can build the resilience of the education sector if we plan and coordinate. Now here we have the 4 key incidents or experiences from hazards that affected St. Vincent and the Grenadines over the last 2 years or so. The COVID-19 impact began around 11th of March in 2020. And as a result, school was closed 1 week early. School reopened around the 25th of May for online learning, but the grade 6 and Form 5 returned to face-to-face to help them prepare for their external exams. During that time, we were hit with dengue fever, which caused deaths of students, and we had to change the school uniform so that children could be more protected. We had to do a lot more fogging and so on and pay more attention to the school environment. During the December period, there was a spike in COVID. And so in January of 2021, school was only able to reopen online. During the Easter break of 2021, school was planning to reopen on the 12th of April. However, the volcano erupted on the 9th of April. So again, schools had to resort to online learning. However, we know that most of our schools are shelters, and so we had to look for alternative locations so that we could continue education for at least the grade 5, the grade 6, and the Form 5. So there were the creation of many learning hubs while all of the other students continue in online learning. During that period, we worked on transitioning persons from the shelters to different locations so that we could have the schools available for the students. And we had some 56 educational facilities, which include primary schools, secondary schools, technical centers, and other educational facilities that were being used as shelters. We also had many of our teachers and principals who were shelter managers or shelter volunteers. And I'll discuss that a little bit later and the implications of that. Then during 2021, so during that period where persons were being sheltered from the volcanic eruption, we were hit by Hurricane Elsa. And so we also had to provide sheltering for those persons within the schools. And therefore, we continued with online learning. And later on in October, we reopened with a blended operation in place. Now, the impact on the education sector was very significant. So we had school closures, mainly due to the COVID-19 and the volcanic eruption. There were loss of lives. So we had students passing as a result of dengue, as a result of COVID-19. There was a loss of instructional time. There was economic setbacks. And of course, we would have heard before that additional devices had to be sourced for students and teachers. And these are things that were not initially planned for. And so that and other issues would have increased the financial burden of the state, including things like installing new facilities at schools, changing certain things that were being used in terms of sanitization and so on. So it was an additional cost to the state. And of course, they all would have presented some psychosocial issues, increased stress and trauma. We had students who, even while they were doing online learning, they were now thrown into shelters, which did not necessarily have internet and so on for them to continue their learning. Now, in relation to the impact, we had over 1,700 volunteers managing shelters, and that included many principals, teachers, and other education staff. These same persons were also involved in the continuity of education. And we had instances where teachers were managing shelters and teaching online during the same day. Many of our teachers who were involved in the shelter operation were not able to get that summer break. And so they went straight from managing shelters, maybe a break of a day or two, and back to the classroom. And that in itself was a challenge. Many complained about being tired and so on. We had school closures, which affected over 26,000 students and about 1,700 educators from pre-primary to post-primary. And of course, we had the college students and the university students who were either available in face-to-face or online programs. In addition, the teachers union would have registered 120 plus teachers who were displaced, being from the red and orange zone closest to the volcano. However, we are well aware that these were not the only teachers and educators who were displaced, but these are the ones who were registered as part of the teachers union database. The economic impact of the eruption on the education sector is estimated at 14.6 million damage, and the losses at another 0.34 million. And that does not cover the cleanup and damage to schools that were being used as shelters. There is another 15 million, again, across 177 schools, which include early childhood centers, 106, 52 primary schools, and 19 secondary schools. There was a project that would have spent $670,000 to retrofit the washrooms of 21 schools, most of which were used as shelters. So we can see that the damage on the education sector was very overwhelming. Now, in terms of other cross-cutting issues in relation to the impact on the education sector, there was the issue of technology, and we've heard it before, that there were devices that were either unsuitable or unavailable. Many of the students had devices, they were given devices, but these devices sometimes may not have been available to them, right? Maybe other family members, there are some students who had to share devices with their siblings and so on. We assumed that all of the children who had devices had access to internet and had access to electricity, but that was not the case based on our research. In relation to the impact on the human aspect, there was a lack of parental supervision, as we heard from the previous speaker. That was also a challenge here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In many instances, parents had to work and were not able to supervise their children in online classes. Teachers, many of them are parents, and so they had to function in a dual role. And so there were instances where they were unable to supervise their own children in online classes. And as I mentioned before, many of our teachers were shelter volunteers and were also engaged in the continuity of learning, which would have been a challenge for them. There was a vaccination policy, which also affected the availability of teachers. And so there was a rush to recruit teachers to replace teachers who did not wish to take the vaccine for one reason or the other. There again was the psychosocial issues, the increased stress, and at different levels. And of course, we had learning loss. Now, the education ministry, we had to respond to the crisis situation by navigating various platforms for online delivery of education. This included an orientation process or several orientation processes for teachers, for students, and even for parents, so that they could adjust to this new modality. National tests, promotion, and external exams had to be adjusted based on the situation that we were experiencing. Psychosocial support was provided by the Ministry of Education for teachers, parents, and students. There were attempts to bridge the digital device gap by providing access, connectivity, and outreach to those students who are not accessing the online sessions. In relation to the use of school as shelters, alternative learning spaces had to be provided. In some instances, a blended approach to learning was undertaken at different times based on the situation. And there had to be adjustments to the regular term date, again, based on what was happening. We were able to reopen school face-to-face in 2021 using COVID smart protocols, including providing transport for students and teachers, emphasizing the use of face masks for teachers and students where it was possible, ensuring that there were safe distances, and we provided additional hand washing station in most schools so that certain health protocol could be observed. We learned many lessons from the experiences, that vulnerabilities existed long before those emergencies. And the root causes of many of these vulnerabilities are poverty and inequality. We also realize that many of our students rely on feeding programs, and so not being in school put them at risk in terms of food security. There was poor attendance in terms of online classes, and measures had to be put in place to find out why students were not attending their online classes. There were issues of access to technology, and in some cases where Wi-Fi, for example, was present, it was not always able to manage the increase in the number of persons that now needed the Wi-Fi. We realize also that IT need to be more integrated into teaching. Some years ago, we made an attempt here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to provide devices to teachers and students. However, these devices were not well integrated into the teaching learning process, right? Had that been done, then it meant that the issues relating to online learning would not have been such a challenge, because already IT would have been integrated into the teaching learning process. In addition, we learned that multi-stakeholder engagement is critical to bridging the human and financial resource gap. And so we need to build stronger partnerships with all stakeholders. And one of our significant challenge was the need for an education management information system to better manage data in normal times, and especially in times of emergencies. Now, how do we go forward? Reimagining education to build a resilient education sector in the future. Education development strategies must be critical to building resilience in the education sector going forward, with a focus on leadership, teaching practices, and policies to guide the creation of alternative learning spaces, a hybrid and blended learning approach, alternative forms of education, and an education information management system. Also, the comprehensive school safety approach presents a systematic way of ensuring that safety considerations are integrated into the education sector. This approach, which has been signed on to by many of our education ministers in the region. In 2017, 12 ministers signed on to this approach. And in 2019, an additional 6 ministers signed on to this approach. This approach focuses on an enabling environment and 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars include ensuring that our educational facilities are designed, located, constructed, and maintained in a manner that ensure the safety of those who use these facilities. Also, the second pillar focuses on school disaster management and ensuring that there is continuity plan, there is contingency planning. And the third pillar focuses on risk, resilience, and climate change education. So ensuring that we build a culture of safety at all levels, from the youngest into adulthood, and that hazards and disaster risk is integrated into our school system. Also, as I mentioned, we need to build stronger partnerships locally, regionally, and internationally in the public and private sector. And this is vital to support the mobilization of resources for a resilient education sector. We need to strengthen child protection policies to ensure that children's rights are protected, especially in times of emergencies. And special consideration should be given to cross-border arrangement where children may be sent to other countries in times of emergencies to ensure that they are protected. In conclusion, the nature of risk has changed significantly over the years, and this has increased the challenges in the education sector. Crisis and emergencies present opportunities to build a more resilient education sector because they uncover gaps that were hidden in the system for many years, and they provide us with an opportunity to plan ahead rather than wait until something happens and then we are placed in an emergency situation trying to respond. This is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Ferdinand. And here, Dr. Ferdinand highlighted some of the hazards that St. Vincent and the Grenadines faced during the period 2020 to 2021. She listed COVID-19, dengue fever, volcanic eruption, and the hurricane. Dr. Ferdinand also explained some of the impacts and that the hazards presented, like school closure, loss of lives, loss of instructional time, additional financial costs, and psychosocial issues. Dr. Ferdinand, I agree with you that being in the Caribbean, where we are prone to disasters and hazards, we really need to build a more resilient education sector and also to integrate hazard and disaster risk in our school system. Thank you so much for your presentation once more. It is my pleasure now to give the floor to our last presenter, Dr. LeFrance Joseph. Dr. Joseph is a teacher researcher in the sociology department of the Faculty of Human Science at the University of Haiti. He is also the director of the Haitian Center for Research in Social Sciences, and his current research focuses on the functioning of Haitian education system in the face of social and political crisis. Dr. Joseph.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Can you share your screen, please?
Yes, I am. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's try again.
Okay. Thank you.
OK. Bonsoir tout le monde et merci de m'avoir invité à participer à cet événement.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm very happy to be here with you all. My presentation is about crisis and numeric education transformation in the education in Haiti. I'm part of the University of Haiti, and I'm also a part of the Research Associate Center. It's part of a research that is being carried in the Center for the Education in Social Sciences in Haiti. In Haiti, the notion of crisis is we talk a lot about this when we talk about education. We cannot talk about the educational system without talking about the crisis issue. We have to consider the crisis as a structural part of this system. The research and reports about the educational system describe the educational system as something obsolete, and this term is used, and it's also based in the past or in the crisis. So it's a very, very common topic when we talk about the educational system in Haiti. So we can say that crisis are seen as a criteria that define the society and the educational system in Haiti. And in every period of Haiti's history, the educational system should respond to greater challenges that cannot be controlled. For example, in the 1950s, there was a transition between the rural and the urban world of the destructuration of the rural economy, which was caused by the destruction of the agriculture, and that produced migration to the urban centers. This huge demographic transformation that created a lot of pressure on the educational system, and that educational system should be able to absorb the demand for that. So this gave an origin to the l'école bullet, which are school institutions that are informal school educational institutions that have most of the population in Haiti. And when we talk about this educational system, we say that between 78 and 80% of schools are private schools, but most of these schools are l'école bullet. These are schools that were created to meet the educational demand. And that respond to this transformation. And we see that the educational system reacts to every crisis, and this invites us to face the need of going beyond the critical perspectives to analyze how the system responds and see the need of understanding the role of this contemporary crisis in the transformation of the educational system at all levels. So what we have to see in this current crisis is how this educational system needs digital tools. When the block country operation was declared, this meant that everything was blocked. Nobody could go to the school. So we had to consider this as an opportunity to introduce or to bring new technological tools. The COVID-19 pandemic was another challenge and opportunity at the beginning of 2020. 1 year after the blocked country situation. So it was a new blocked country. And for the ministry, this was something new. The Ministry of Education reacted in a different way to the COVID-19 situation. We have to understand of the digital transformation in the response strategies to the contemporaneous crisis of the educational system. For this research, I used a mixed method, quantitative and qualitative. It was a questionnaire of about 120 schools that was applied in 120 schools in the West and in the Artigues departments. And the qualitative component implies the critique platform in order to digitalize education and respond or meet the educational needs in the pandemic context, and also videos in YouTube with free access and 9 interviews with different authorities. The results show that in Haiti, there are different ways to respond to the crisis. For example, the response from the Ministry of Education to the PY-LOC or to the LOC country crisis was to set or establish programs with minimal skills or competencies. They took into account the fact of reducing the pedagogic program, and they didn't offer other pedagogic tools. And these schools tend to reduce the programs to face the time barriers. And this also gave to the schools the opportunity to take their first steps towards the digital education. We have 2 different strategies to face different problems. This is for showing you an example of the minimal competency program. In the introduction, we highlighted that crises have pushed us to respond in this way, and schools responded in another way. This program had as an objective take into account the essential part of every discipline. So results indicate that most of the schools were closed or remained closed. 35% of the schools worked at a distance with a distance format, and 65% were closed. Schools that use this distance learning mechanism or process were schools that could continue working and in order to respond about the question about how the schools function during COVID-19 crisis, only 37% continues working or functioning. So we have something similar between these 2 periods, the one of the locked country and the COVID-19, the tools used to work in the crisis times and maintain the continuity of schools. We saw that WhatsApp was the most used platform by schools. And then we also had the platform from schools and then other platforms such as Zoom or other platforms. The digital transformation of the school is an answer to respond to crisis. WhatsApp is a very popular communication tool. It was the most accessible tool to maintain the continuity of education in a period, in this period of crisis, but pedagogy via WhatsApp is an imperfect solution. It's not a perfect solution. It's not efficient for teaching and educating. A school headmaster told us it wasn't efficient for teaching and for educating students, but without this tool, they would have missed or lost the whole year. And another student told us WhatsApp it's not a good pedagogic tool. The Pratik platform that was inaugurated in 2020 as a solution to crisis is a Moodle's platform that has not been finished yet, but only 5% of the schools stated they had heard about this platform. It's not very well known in the school community. And the videos that are shared in YouTube are not a standardized video. YouTube's content has little access, and most of the videos have less than 100 views. And there is an irregular publication of the last video that was published last year. This is a screenshot of the platform. That shows this information. We have seen this page filed until March 2022. The platform was not finished. This page had the programs that had been reduced, and since April, this platform was became this that we saw in the screen. So conclusions are that it taught us that Pratik was a failure as a platform of education for the schools in Haiti, but it left some foundations to progress in the digital transformation in Haiti. It's a pedagogic platform for the schools. So this introduction was very important, although it failed. Pedagogy via WhatsApp gave a great opportunity to most schools that worked during the crisis, but the intrinsic limits of this tool plus technological barriers for people who don't have the app in their mobile phones, or the mobile phones of the students that cannot download documents or take pictures. This meant a lot of problems because it supposes that students learn and study online, but the WhatsApp tool does not allow this. And the protests that were even more complicated in Haiti in the last years made the system even weaker. So there is this need of thinking and understanding the experiences, educational experiences, and thinking with the stakeholders the future of the digital transformation in Haiti.
Julian.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I wasn't so sure if you had ended your presentation. It was really a pleasure listening to your presentation today. I saw you really highlighted that the tools that were used, especially WhatsApp, was not really the best for disseminating information to students during the crisis, during the lockdown period. You explained that some of the principals and teachers believed that it was inefficient in teaching and learning. Sorry. And also, you saw that COVID provided the opportunity for digital education and laid the groundwork for advancing digital transformation for education in Haiti. And I do agree with you. Thank you so much for your presentation this morning. At this time, now we're going to open up to the audience for questions.
Ahora vamos a abrir a que la audiencia.
Sorry. If you have any questions, you can use the question and answer function available on Zoom. This event is also being streamed through our social media platforms and network. So we will be monitoring our social media network. So please participate and ask questions throughout. I'm going to ask Raul to help me to monitor the chats so that we can see when questions are posted for our panelists. So if you have any questions for Dr. Knight, Dr. Bisessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph, you can go right ahead. Any questions already? There's a question for Dr. Ferdinand in the chat. And someone is asking, could you tell me more about the methodology used to introduce the online teaching and learning devices in Haiti?
I couldn't understand the question. Maybe not Haiti.
So it's supposed to be, it's addressed to Dr. Ferdinand, but and that's from, yes, Dr. Joseph. So I think it is St. Vincent he's referring to.
So what we had to do, we had to find a platform that could be used by all of our schools and where the ministry could actually manage. And even while there were schools that were already using different platforms like Moodle, the ministry worked along with other local stakeholders to find a platform, and the Microsoft Teams was the platform that was finally settled on based on the discussion with the various stakeholders. And once the platform was decided on, then the ministry worked on training for the teachers, setting up a help desk, training for students to help them to navigate the platform. And then the platform was rolled out. In the meantime, while that was being done, there were classes that were done via television and different medium, so that there would not be too much of a loss while the platform was being developed for the students. In addition to that, devices were also distributed to support the students. And like I said, there were issues in terms of electricity and so on, and those were addressed. And where there were still gaps where students were not able to access online education, there was what we call school in a bag, where materials were printed and distributed to students who did not have access to devices or other issues. So it was a process that we went through.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferdinand. Any other questions for any other four presenters? I would like to pose a question at this time to Dr. Bisessa. Dr. Bisessa, you spoke about teaching and learning gains during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the gains for teachers was the skills in teaching in a blended setting, as well as learning new technological skills. Do you have any intentions in doing a further study to see how the new learning aids were integrated into teaching and how it has affected or is affecting the way the teachers teach and the students learn in the Grenadian context?
Thank you for that question. At the moment, no, I didn't intend to do any further study in it, but you, of course, you have whet my appetite. So I will take it under consideration. However, I do have a student in Guyana. She's doing her master's and I'm supervising her thesis. And she is doing something with the follow-up as to what the teachers are doing now with the increase in professional gains, with increase in digital literacy, and how they are implementing it in the classroom. So thank you for that question.
You're most welcome and thank you. I look forward to that study, that research. Raul, is there anything on your side?
There is, Julian, a comment from Monsieur Bayard from Haiti. He's representative from Haiti, from the Ministry of Education. And he's highlighting a program that the country is running on the use of radio and television. So what we call the, as we know as low tech, like low technologies. So maybe I would like to know the perspective of the researchers on how to address how the communities, countries are addressing this digital gap, basically, and what opportunities do you see with other kind of material as printed material or low technologies, as Monsieur Bayard is commenting.
Thank you so much for that. That was from Bayard. Thanks, Raul, for assisting me there. Question for Dr. Knight. You mentioned 4 risk factors for students experiencing potential exclusion. I just want to ask, how were the countries addressing those barriers? And were they more prevalent in some countries than the other? Like with the 4 barriers, say, lack of parental support or proper support for special education needs, were they more prevalent in one country than the other?
Yes, thank you so much, Julianne, for that question. I did not I did not try to separate that part of the data by country, because we wanted to have an idea of what the regional profile looked like. When we collected the administrative data in phase 1 that looked at the extent to which students were out of school, we would have drilled it down by country level. And there's a previous publication, and the Eastern Caribbean Study Report actually provides insight into this by country as well. But we didn't drill the second phase of the data. I didn't separate it by country at all. So I can't tell you right now whether Grenada had parental involvement, etc., as a greater factor. The data is there though. So if a country, for example, wants to drill down into what it looked like for their particular country, we can easily refer back to the data to get that done. But I don't have that at hand immediately. But what we did, we were able to pull was that it was an overall look at where those primary factors were situated. And the reason why this happened was that when we completed the Eastern Caribbean study and we presented, we traveled to each of the 7 countries to present those findings to those ministries of education. What we found was that we had discussed about 12 different factors that were impacting on education. And when we presented the report to the ministers, for example, at an OECS meeting, the ministers said, well, 12 factors are just too many. We know that there are multiplicity of factors affecting students and creating difficulties, but limited resources means we can't address all 12 at once. So you have to find some way of helping us to identify which ones are the priority at a particular time, so we can identify where the resources immediately can be directed. And so the second phase of the research was really intended to provide that kind of support so that the region, as it comes together at the OECS level, for example, among ministers, they can have some kind of support in terms of prioritizing where that focus is. And the research is really showing us that systematic supports for struggling learners have to be necessarily one of those areas that we put some funds and we put some action behind.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Knight, and I do agree, because we cannot allow our students to be falling behind like that. I mean, we saw 17% of our primary school students and 33% of our secondary. That is way too much. So thank you so much for that information now. If there are no, we are running out of time. So if there's nothing else, Raul, I'd just like to thank all of our presenters today, Dr. Knight, Dr. Bissessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for the job that you're doing. I think our region is right off. Yes. Go ahead, Martial, sorry.
Excuse-moi, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais faire une petite question à Monsieur Lefranc, si c'est possible, toute court. Monsieur Lefranc, bonjour.
I would just like to ask a quick question to Lefranc briefly. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, everything that you presented. And I do have a question regarding to talk about this new pedagogy, this digital pedagogy regarding WhatsApp. And my question is, how do you see the future regarding the balance? I don't know how to state this between digital technology like WhatsApp and other technologies like radio, TV, and in territories like Haiti, where connectivity is difficult. How do you visualize that? The future is difficult to foresee because it depends on the advancement of technology. For example, in Haiti, we have access that is limited to electricity and internet, and also to phones. So many people have phones, but it's not capable of taking on the technological load to be able to make the different applications work. So it's a challenge. It's a very big challenge that ministry has to deal with, and we have to work with other players of the society, other stakeholders, to be able to make available of the society the necessary infrastructure to make education work. That's the first aspect. But the second aspect that we need to consider is the availability of an online material on YouTube, radio, or on TV are consumed by the population, but we do not know how they consume it. We don't know who is consuming that content. So what I am more interested in the role of the ministry, allowing to serve as so that we need to see how long distance or distance education can be effective. And we have to do that with all of the players that are interested in what we see is that the ministry carries out their work with this practical platform, but that a tool has their own work to resolve their own issues. So it's necessary to have something in common to be able to use the progress or the advance of WhatsApp, which is pretty basic, but that was the only tool that allowed the continuity of pedagogy for the majority of the schools that continued working during this crisis period. So everything that we have to understand, this role that WhatsApp plays currently in Haiti and the ministry, and most likely they will have to work stronger. We need to contact to be able to deal with this, but this platform, and I have all of the information to see how it works and what answers we can give to the needs of education. And the problem in Haiti is that the crises are so numerous, and that the political problem, provokes a difficulty in the pedagogical advancements. It's a chain, a constant crisis, and obviously that affects. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Joseph. Anything else on your end, Marcella? Raul, anything from you? Okay, well, at this time, I just want to again thank all of our presenters, Dr. Knight, Dr. Bissessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph. Thanks for your willingness to participate. And as a PhD student, I can personally say that I benefited from all of your research today, and I know our audience would share my sentiments. So thanks again. I will now hand over to Marcela to continue the rest of the program. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Julien, pour cette extraordinaire facilitation. C'était vraiment intéressant.
Thank you very much for these presentations. It was very interesting to see all the particular characteristics of the territories. It is something that interests us very much to have this view, this perspective. And to end, I would like to thank all the researchers, and it's very important to continue with this research and to find ways to propagate this or disseminate this knowledge. And that way we can try to do research. It's very interesting to listen to all of you. And I would like to give the floor to Raul Chacon, KIX LAC director, to be able to finalize.
Thank you all for your insights. Are really interesting pieces of research presented today. Just a few words to close this. I think we all agree that we are living in crisis and emergencies. These are the times. The issue that we have been discussing is related with what the researcher from Haiti was mentioning about the crisis as a structural problem, and we see this in our region. We see situations of violence, inequalities, well, natural disasters that also are coming often maybe related to the climate change, of course. So issues that we need to continue discussing, and just to put a highlight in the student learning loss that is a priority for all our countries, all the region. It's a global priority as well, and for that, just to emphasize the need for stronger information systems, data assessment, learning assessment, to follow up on how to work on and develop those strategies to recover learning. That would be one of the main priorities regarding to those affected and disadvantaged populations mainly. So thank you very much to all, and we will continue in contact with all of you very soon. Thank you very much.